Nobody thought a 120-pound German Shepherd had any business being that close to a baby. He was too large, too powerful, too much of everything that fear invents at 3 in the morning when you're a new parent and the world feels made of glass. That's what they said. That's what they believed. And on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday morning, the decision had already been made. Eric was leaving. The shelter had been called. The clock was ticking. But Christiana wasn't willing to let it end that way. She proposed one final test. A camera, a pink lunch plate, 20 minutes alone. And what that camera recorded, nobody in that house was ready for. The baby was laughing. Eric was watching. And when something went wrong at that little table, the truth about that dog became impossible to deny. Before we go any further, welcome to our channel. We are genuinely glad you found us. If a story like this one already has your attention, hit subscribe right now. Our team has set a goal to reach 100 subscribers so we can bring you stories exactly like this one every single day. We're building something here, and we'd love for you to be part of it from the beginning. Now, on a scale of 1 to 10, drop your rating for this story in the comments. We read every single one. Now, let's go back to that Tuesday morning. Because it started the way it always does when a decision has already been made, with a voice that wasn't asking anymore. The kitchen that morning felt smaller than it was. Donald was standing at the counter when Christiana came down the stairs, their daughter balanced on her hip, still soft with sleep, clutching the collar of Christiana's shirt with one small fist. Eric was already on the floor near the far wall, his massive black body settled low, his broad head resting between his front paws, his amber eyes moving from the door to the baby the moment she appeared, the way they always did. Christiana saw the phone in Donald's hand before she saw his face. She saw the way he held it, not scrolling, not checking, gripping it like something already decided. And then she heard the address, their address, coming out of his mouth in a tone she had never heard him use before. Flat, final, done. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Donald turned. He held up one hand before she could speak. It's settled, Christiana. I made the call this morning. They're sending someone this afternoon. You didn't tell me, she said. Her voice was very quiet. I knew what you'd say. Then you knew you were wrong. Donald set the phone on the counter and crossed his arms. He wasn't angry, or rather, his anger had already passed through that phase and come out the other side as something harder to argue with. Certainty. Fred was over here 3 days ago. He's been around dogs his whole life. He looked at Eric, just looked at him, standing in the hallway, and told me that a dog that size around an infant is not a question of if, it's a question of when. I'm not going to be the father who finds out he was right. Christiana set her daughter into the high chair and clicked the tray into place. The baby reached immediately for the plastic cup on the tray, babbling at it like it owed her something. Eric's ears lifted. His eyes tracked the child's hands. He did not move. He did not make a sound. He simply watched her, the way he had watched her every single morning for 11 months. Fred, Christiana said slowly, has never lived with Eric. Fred has never watched Eric lower himself to the floor so she can reach his ears. Fred has never seen Eric stand between her and the front door every time someone knocks. Fred has never once sat in this house at 2 in the morning and seen what I've seen. She turned to face her husband. Fred is afraid of something he doesn't know, and you're making a permanent decision based on that. Donald's jaw tightened. I'm making a decision based on my daughter's safety. So am I, Christiana said, and then, after a pause that lasted just long enough to feel like a door swinging open, then let him prove it. Donald's eyes narrowed. What? You heard me, she was already moving. If you're so certain that dog is a danger, if Fred is so certain, then let the camera decide. Not you, not Fred, the footage. She pulled the small camera from the shelf above the microwave, the one they used for travel. I'll set her up at the table with her lunch. Eric stays in the room. We go to the kitchen and watch the live feed. 20 minutes, not a word from either of us. Donald stared at her. You want to leave her alone with that animal and call it a test? I want to leave her alone with the dog who has never once, in 11 months, given either of us a single reason for fear. Her voice didn't waver. And I want you to watch, really watch. And when it's over, when nothing happens, or when something does, we go from there. No shelter calls until you've seen it for yourself. A long silence moved through the kitchen. Eric hadn't shifted. His amber eyes were still soft, still on the baby, who was now attempting to stack her crackers into a tower and losing, laughing at her own failure. Donald looked at the dog, then at his daughter, then back at Christiana. Something crossed his face, not agreement exactly, but the absence of a better argument. 20 minutes, he said finally, and the second anything. 20 minutes, she confirmed, and then we'll know. She set the camera on the counter across from the high chair, angled it down toward the pink-divided lunch plate, its 3 compartments already filled with soft corn, small cubes of sweet potato, and thin slices of banana. She checked the live feed on her phone. Clear picture, good angle, the red light blinked steady. Their daughter was already in the chair, her blonde hair loose around her face, her tiny fingers drumming on the tray the way she always did when she was happy and waiting. She was wearing a soft white top with small buttons down the front, and she smelled, as she always did in the mornings, faintly of baby shampoo and warm sleep. Eric rose from his position near the wall. He crossed the kitchen floor quietly, 3 long, measured strides, and settled himself to the left of the high chair, lowering his 120-pound body onto the tile with the careful deliberateness of a dog who understands that how you arrive matters as much as where you end up. His chin came to rest just above the edge of the tray. His amber eyes were level with the baby's. She looked at him, he looked at her, she giggled, he blinked. Christiana watched this from the doorway, her throat tight. "Come on," she said to Donald, her voice barely above a whisper. He followed her into the kitchen. She placed the phone between them on the counter. On the screen, the baby picked up a piece of sweet potato and held it out in Eric's direction. Not to feed him, she was too young for that kind of intentionality, but with the generalized, joyful offering that toddlers make to the world when they are pleased with something and want to share the fact of it. Eric's nose moved forward just slightly, and then he pulled it back. He did not take the food. He simply acknowledged the gesture and returned his chin to its position above the tray's edge, watching her face. Christiana's throat tightened. She had seen him do that before, decline food the baby offered him, not because he wasn't interested, but because something in his understanding of the situation told him the food was hers. She had seen it twice in the past month, and both times she had not said anything to Donald, because she had learned, slowly and then all at once, that the observations she carried about Eric could not be transferred to her husband through language. They could only be witnessed. And so she had waited for a moment like this one, a moment with a camera, with evidence, with no room left for dismissal, and she had built the conditions for Donald to see it himself. Whether he was seeing it now, she couldn't tell. Baby banged both hands on the tray in the sudden, percussive way she had when a thought arrived too fast for her hands to stay still, and the sound of it came through the phone's speaker and made Donald's jaw tighten reflexively. Eric's ears moved, not back, not flattened, but swiveling toward the sound with the attentive, cataloging movement of an animal who processes the world primarily through what he hears. He identified the source. He identified the cause. His ears returned to their resting position. His eyes stayed on the baby's face. 3 minutes had passed. Christiana knew, because she was counting without meaning to, the way you count when you are waiting for something, and time has become the only thing you have any influence over. Donald shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He uncrossed his arms and then crossed them again, higher this time, and she felt the movement of air beside her as he leaned slightly forward toward the screen. She did not look at him directly. Looking at him directly would invite conversation, and conversation right now would break the only thing she had asked him for: the willingness to watch, without editing what he saw through the filter of what he'd already decided. So she looked at the screen, at her daughter, who was now attempting to balance a corn kernel on top of a piece of sweet potato, with the solemn concentration of a small person who has no idea that anything in her world is anything other than entirely secure. At the dog beside her, still, present, amber-eyed, breathing, who had made himself into something so reliably safe that a child not yet old enough to understand danger had never, in 18 months of sharing space with him, learned to feel any. Outside, a car moved down the street. A neighbor's door opened and closed. The ordinary world continued at its ordinary pace, indifferent to the fact that something was being decided in this kitchen, quietly, without argument, without anyone raising their voice. Just a camera, and a child, and a dog who didn't know he was on trial. And two parents who had stopped breathing at almost exactly the same moment, for reasons that had nothing to do with each other and everything to do with what they were both beginning, separately and slowly, to understand. 7 minutes in, Eric sat up. It was not a sudden movement. Nothing about Eric was ever sudden. That was one of the things Christiana had understood about him early, back when he was still new to the house, and she was still learning the grammar of him. He moved the way large, self-possessed animals move, with a deliberateness that looked like slowness, but was actually something closer to intention. He rose from his resting position in a single, fluid motion, bringing his full height to bear beside the high chair, and his ears, those large, expressive ears that she had spent months learning to read, lifted and angled forward, oriented toward the baby with a focus that was almost architectural in its precision. On the phone screen, the shift was visible and immediate. Beside her, she felt Donald's posture change. There, he said, his voice was low, but it had something in it, a tightening, a readiness. You see that? Look at the way he's watching her. Christiana looked at the screen. She saw Eric sitting upright, ears forward, eyes fixed on the baby with an intensity that had not been there 60 seconds ago. She saw her daughter, unbothered, working a piece of corn around the edge of her tray with one determined finger, babbling to herself in the private language of toddlers who have not yet discovered that other people cannot understand them. She saw the space between them, close, deliberate, charged with something. She and Donald were looking at the same image. They were not seeing the same thing. What Donald saw, she understood, was a predator shifting modes, a large animal that had been patient and still suddenly becoming alert, its attention sharpening, its body no longer at rest, but organized around something. He had read articles. He had listened to Fred. He had spent weeks constructing a particular story about what danger looked like, and what he saw on the screen fit that story with uncomfortable precision. The size, the stillness broken by sudden attention, the eyes that did not move from the child. What Christiana saw was a sentinel changing shifts. She had watched Eric do this enough times to know the difference between the alertness of threat and the alertness of responsibility, and the difference was not subtle once you knew how to look for it. A dog coiling toward aggression tightens, the muscles around the shoulders, the set of the jaw, the way the tail either stiffens or drops entirely. A dog intensifying his attention on something he is protecting does something different. He opens. His posture expands rather than compresses. His ears go forward rather than back. His eyes soften at the center, even as they sharpen at the edges. It is the look of someone who has decided to be fully present because the situation requires it, not the look of someone calculating how to strike. Eric's ears were forward. His jaw was loose. His tail, just visible at the bottom of the frame, was low and still, not tucked, not raised, simply resting, the way it rested when he was calm and focused and entirely himself. He's not coiling, Christiana said quietly. He's paying attention. Those are different things. They look the same from here, Donald said. They look the same if you don't know what you're looking for. He said nothing to that. She hadn't said it to win anything. She had said it because it was true, and because there was a version of this conversation where the distinction mattered enormously, and she needed him to at least hold the possibility of it, even if he wasn't ready to accept it yet. On the screen, the baby looked up from her tray and found Eric's face. She looked at him the way she always looked at him, without wariness, without the instinctive caution that children sometimes display around large animals they don't know, with the open, proprietorial affection of a small person who has decided that something belongs to her and she to it. She said something. It was not a real word. It was the shape of a word, the intention of one, offered upward toward his face, with both hands raised slightly from the tray. Eric blinked, long and slow. His ears, still forward, softened fractionally at the tips. Christiana pressed her lips together. She had seen that blink before too. She knew what it meant in the language she had spent a year learning without a teacher, that slow, deliberate closing and opening of the eyes that behaviorists called a calming signal, a gesture dogs made toward those they were at ease with, those they trusted, those they were telling, in the only vocabulary available to them, "I am not a threat. I am here. You are safe." Her daughter, who could not possibly have known any of that, reached out and patted the side of his face with an open palm. He did not flinch. He turned his head slightly into the contact, the way he always did, and held still while she explored the terrain of his cheek with the clumsy, tender curiosity of a child who is learning that the world is full of things worth touching. Donald made a sound that was not quite a word. Christiana glanced at him sidelong. His arms had dropped. Not completely, they were still crossed, but the architecture of the gesture had changed, gone from a wall into something more like a habit he hadn't noticed he was still holding. His eyes were on the screen, and whatever certainty had been living in his face since morning had developed, in the last 30 seconds, a small but unmistakable crack. He did not say anything, neither did she. Because the image on the screen was doing the only talking that mattered now, and it was saying something that Fred had never accounted for, something that no second-hand fear and no hallway impression had ever made room for. It was saying, "Look closer, look at what is actually here." It happened in the space between one breath and the next. Christiana almost missed it. She had been watching Eric's face on the screen, the way his eyes tracked the baby's hands, the way his ears moved in small, continuous adjustments like a satellite dish reorienting toward a signal, and so her attention was on him rather than on the geography of the room. It was Donald who saw the baby move first, though he did not understand what he was seeing until after it was already over. Their daughter had finished with the sweet potato. This was apparent from the way she had pushed the remaining pieces to the far edge of her tray with the decisive, emphatic gesture she used for things she was done with, and had turned her attention to something more interesting, which was, apparently, the world beyond the high chair. She leaned. Not far, not with any real momentum behind it, but with the casual, unguarded lean of a child who has not yet developed a reliable relationship with her own center of gravity, tipping sideways to see something below the edge of the tray, her small body angling toward the right side of the chair. On that side, 18 inches from the high chair's leg, was the corner of the low kitchen table, wooden, squared, exactly the height of a falling toddler's temple. Christiana saw it in the same moment Eric moved. He did not bark, he did not startle. He rose from his position on the left side of the chair and crossed behind it, 1, 2, 3 strides of quiet, purposeful movement, and placed himself between the baby and the table's corner before the lean had progressed far enough to become a fall. His body simply arrived there, 120 pounds of black fur and deliberate muscle, filling the space between child and hard edge like something slotted into a place it had always been meant to occupy. He did not touch her. He did not correct the lean with his body. He simply made himself into a wall, close enough that if she continued in that direction, she would meet the softness of him before she met anything that could hurt her. The baby, encountering resistance she hadn't expected, pushed gently against his side, realized it was Eric, and immediately lost interest in whatever she had been leaning toward. She grabbed a fistful of his fur instead, which was what she always did when she found him within reach, and turned her attention to that. The whole thing lasted perhaps 4 seconds. "What did he just do?" Christiana said. She had not meant it as a question, and it didn't come out as one. She felt Donald shift beside her. He moved around her. He was probably trying to get closer to the food. She turned and looked at her husband directly for the first time since they had come to stand at this counter. He was watching the screen with his jaw set in the particular way it set when he was explaining something he was not entirely sure of. His eyes did not move to meet hers. "The food," she said carefully, "is on the other side." A pause, small, significant. She looked back at the screen. Eric had resettled himself on the right side of the chair now, between the baby and the table, his new position as natural and unannounced as if he had always been there. His chin was not on the tray anymore, it was lower, resting near his own forepaws, which placed his eyeline closer to the floor, closer to the height of someone very small who might be moving at that level. He was watching the room from the baby's perspective. Christiana understood this with a clarity that arrived not as thought, but as sensation. a sudden, full-bodied understanding of what she was watching. He was not guarding from his own vantage point, he was guarding from hers. She had read once, in the early months, when she was still trying to build a vocabulary for what she was observing, that dogs with strong protective instincts will sometimes physically model the vulnerability of the creature they are guarding, lowering themselves to eye level, adjusting their position to mirror the charge's sightlines rather than their own. At the time she had filed it away as interesting without knowing quite what to do with it. Now it sat in her chest like a key that had just found its lock. Donald had not responded to what she'd said about the food. He hadn't agreed and he hadn't pushed back, which was its own kind of answer. The silence of a man who has made an argument and watched it land badly and is deciding whether to retrieve it or leave it where it fell. She did not press him. She had learned, over years, that pressing Donald in the moments when he was quietly reconsidering something caused him to harden rather than open. The shift happening in him right now was fragile, and it was real, and it would not survive being named too early, so she let it exist without touching it. Let the footage do what footage does. Let the truth accumulate at its own pace. On the screen, their daughter had given up on Eric's fur and returned to her corn with renewed enthusiasm, apparently restored by the interruption to a fresh appetite. She banged the tray twice. Eric's ear swiveled toward the sound. His eyes stayed on the middle distance, not the baby, not any single point, but the room, the whole room, taking inventory of it the way someone takes inventory of a space they are responsible for. Nothing about it was dramatic. Nothing about it announced itself. It was quiet and small and entirely easy to dismiss if you had already decided what you were looking for. But Christiana had not decided that. She had only ever decided to watch. And what watching had given her, in this moment and in all the moments before it, was the slow, irrefutable accumulation of a truth that required no argument, no defense, and no permission. It only required a camera, and enough time, and someone willing to look. The cup was red, small-handled, the kind with a weighted base designed to resist tipping, designed being the operative word, because their daughter had long ago discovered that the weighted base was only a suggestion, and that with sufficient lateral enthusiasm, any object on a tray could be persuaded toward the edge of it. She wanted the cup. It had migrated, through the incremental physics of mealtime, to the far right corner of the tray, just beyond the comfortable reach of a child who has not yet fully negotiated the relationship between wanting something and being able to get it without pitching herself sideways to claim it. For a moment she simply looked at it. The way she looked at things, she was deciding whether to pursue. Then she decided. She leaned. Not a dramatic lean, not the kind of movement that announces itself as dangerous, just the small, committed tipping of a body that has forgotten, in the enthusiasm of the moment, that it is attached to a chair with a finite edge. Her weight shifted right, her shoulder dipping, her center of gravity sliding past the point where it was entirely her own anymore, and the cup, as cups do, began its own slow migration toward the tray's lip. Eric was already moving. Christiana saw it happen on the screen in the same instant that her own hand rose involuntarily from the counter, a reflex, reaching toward an image on a phone that was not reachable, that was happening in another room, that was already, before her hand had traveled 3 inches, already being handled. He came from her left, not running, not lunging, moving with that particular purposeful quiet she had come to recognize as his highest gear, the one that looked unhurried but covered ground in a way that made urgency unnecessary. He was beside the chair before the lean had completed itself, his left shoulder connecting with the baby's right side, not pushing, not correcting, simply being there, 120 pounds of presence absorbing the drift of her before it could become anything worse. The cup tipped over the edge of the tray and fell, hit the floor, rolled. The baby hung suspended for one moment against the warm wall of him. Then she found her balance. Christiana thought about what it means to protect someone so consistently that they never know they needed protecting. She thought about all the moments she had witnessed that looked like nothing because he had ensured they would, all the small repositionings, the quiet arrivals, the gentle absorption of dangers that never became incidents because he reached them first. She thought about how close they had come, this morning, to sending that away. How close Donald had come to dismantling something irreplaceable, because someone else's fear had been louder than the evidence living in his own kitchen. She thought about Fred. She did not say anything about Fred. There would be time for that, but not yet. Donald almost sent Eric away before this moment ever happened. He almost let someone else's fear make his decision for him. If you've ever been judged or had something precious taken from you because someone else was afraid of what they didn't understand, drop a paw prints in the comments right now. And if you believe that fear is not the same thing as wisdom, hit that like button. Don't let the algorithm bury this story the way Donald almost buried Eric. Keep watching because the most important moment hasn't happened yet. Nothing about it announced itself. That was the thing about the moment when it came. It arrived wearing the same clothes as every other moment in the past 17 minutes, dressed in the ordinary textures of a Tuesday lunch, indistinguishable from the mundane until it was already something else entirely. There was no warning sound, no sudden movement. Nothing on the screen changed in a way that would have caused either of them to lean forward before it had already begun. Their daughter had found the last piece of soft carrot on her tray. It had been hiding beneath the corn, which was where things she didn't immediately eat tended to migrate, and the discovery of it clearly delighted her in the disproportionate way that toddlers are delighted by small things, as if the carrot had been a gift, as if the tray had been keeping it for her. She picked it up and held it aloft for a moment, showing it to the room, and then she laughed at something, not the carrot, not Eric, not anything visible on the screen, just something interior and private and entirely her own, the way children laugh when joy becomes briefly too large to stay inside them. She put the carrot in her mouth. She inhaled, still laughing, still mid-laugh, the tail end of it still moving through her at exactly the wrong moment. The laugh stopped. Not gradually, not winding down the way sounds do when they are finished. It stopped the way a power cut stops a room, completely, immediately, leaving behind a quality of absence that was louder than the sound had been. One moment there was the bright, tinny thread of her giggle coming through the phone speaker. The next there was nothing, and the nothing had a shape to it, a weight, and Christiana felt it register in her body before her mind had finished processing what she was seeing on the screen. Her daughter's face had changed. The pink of it was deepening, not the healthy flush of a child who has been laughing, but something that went further, something that moved toward red with a purposefulness that had no business on the face of a child sitting in a high chair on an ordinary Tuesday. Her small hands came up to the tray. She slapped it once, the way she always slapped it when she wanted something. Then again, harder, and this time there was nothing of delight in it. Her eyes were wide, and they were moving in a way that Christiana had never seen them move before, not looking at anything, not tracking, just wide and filling with something that a child that age does not yet have language for, but already knows completely. She was not coughing, she was not crying. She was silent in the way that precedes both, the silence that means the airway is having a conversation with itself that nothing from outside can join. Christiana's hand gripped the counter's edge. Beside her, Donald had gone absolutely still, not the still of a moment ago when he was processing and recalibrating and quietly revising. A different still, the still of a person whose body has received information that the mind has not yet caught up to, and has made the decision, unilaterally, to stop everything and wait. On the screen, Eric's head came up from his pause. Not with the slow, adjusting lift he used when a sound interested him, or the alert swivel he used when something moved at the edge of the room. This was different. This was the head coming up the way it comes up when something in the environment has shifted below the level of human perception, something carried on the air, in the chemistry of the room, in the invisible signals a body in distress begins broadcasting before it has made a sound or a movement that anyone standing nearby could name. His nostrils opened. She could see them on the screen, the dark openings widening and working, pulling the room in, reading it. His ears went forward, all the way forward, rigid, fixed. Every muscle in the visible length of him changed. Not the tightening of threat, she knew that, she had learned that distinction, and she was certain of it, but something else. Something that looked from the outside like what it was from the inside, the total, instantaneous organization of a large animal around a single purpose. Every soft thing about him, the loose jaw, the half-masked eyes, the easy breathing, closed down and was replaced by this. This absolute, focused, biological lock onto the child beside him. He rose. No hesitation, no reading the room further, no second assessment. He was on his feet in one motion, and his eyes were on the baby, and the baby's face was now the color of something that made Christiana's vision go strange at the edges, because her own body had stopped remembering to breathe. Donald made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when language arrives too late to be useful and the body speaks instead. Low, involuntary, stripped of everything except the raw signal of a parent who has just understood that his child is in trouble. He reached for the door. Christiana caught his arm, not because she wasn't terrified. She was. Her hand on his sleeve was shaking, and she felt it shaking, and she did not let go. She caught his arm because the camera was still running, and Eric was already moving, and something in the deep, observant part of her that had been paying attention for 11 months told her, in terms that were not quite thought and not quite feeling, but some third thing between them, that the worst thing they could do right now was open that door before they understood what was happening. Because Eric understood it already. He had understood it before either of them had seen it. That was what the nostrils were for. That was what the chemistry of distress meant to an animal built to read the language of bodies, the shift in breath, the change in scent, that cortisol and oxygen deprivation right on the air around a person in crisis. He hadn't waited for the visual confirmation. He hadn't needed the red face or the silent open mouth or the small hands hitting the tray. He had known from the inside of the moment what both parents had only just arrived at from the outside of it. He had known, and he had risen, and he was already there. Most people watching would have assumed what Donald assumed, that a dog sensing distress meant danger was coming from the dog. This is one of the most costly misreadings of animal behavior that exists. Research into canine scent detection confirms that dogs can identify changes in human biochemistry linked to medical emergencies, including oxygen deprivation, before any visible symptoms appear. What Eric did in that moment was not mysterious. It was biology in service of love. Learn to tell the difference between a dog responding to a threat and a dog responding to one. It matters more than you think. 3 strides. That was all the distance there was between where Eric had been standing and where he needed to be, and he covered it in the time it takes to blink, not rushing, not scrambling, but moving with the kind of targeted efficiency that has no excess in it, no wasted motion, nothing that was not entirely in service of the single thing that mattered. He went to the back of the chair. Not to the side, where he had spent the last 17 minutes, not to the front where her face was, to the back, which was the position that made no instinctive sense to either parent watching from the kitchen until the moment it made complete and terrible sense, until Christiana understood, in one full-body flash of comprehension, that he knew, not approximately, not instinctively in the loose, generous way people use that word when they mean something they can't explain. He knew with the specificity of an animal whose understanding of the physical world runs deeper than language, deeper than reasoning, down into something that human beings lost access to so long ago they have forgotten it was ever theirs. He knew where the obstruction was. He knew what was needed. He went to the place from which he could provide it. He did not touch the chair with his body. He did not jostle it, did not cause it to shift on the tile, did not add any motion to a situation that already had too much wrongness in it. He placed himself behind her with a precision that seemed impossible for an animal his size, all 120 pounds of him arranged in the 18 inches between the back of the high chair and the kitchen wall, his broad chest behind her, his head coming forward over her right shoulder. And then he pressed. The flat of his nose, wide, black, warm, found the space between her small shoulder blades with an accuracy that would not have been possible from a smaller animal, that required exactly the mass and the reach and the broad geography of a face that everyone in this story had called too much. He pressed once, firm and deliberate, and held it for a half-second, and released. The baby's body rocked forward slightly with the pressure. Nothing happened. He pressed again, same place, more deliberate this time, leaning into it with the weight behind his nose, the full intention of his body focused into that single point of contact between his face and her back. Steady, controlled. Certain in a way that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with something that lived beneath training, beneath instinct even, in the oldest part of what he was. Christiana realized she was making a sound, not words, just sound, low and continuous, the kind that escapes without permission when the body is holding more than it can contain in silence. Donald's hand was on the door handle. She could feel the tension in him from where she stood, the coiled, agonized restraint of a father whose every instinct was screaming at him to move, to act, to insert himself between his child and whatever was happening on the screen, and who was holding himself at the door only because Christiana's hand was on his arm and something in him, something that had been quietly shifting since the cup and the corner and the slow blink, trusted her enough to wait one more second. One more second was all it took. On the third press, the third firm, measured, deliberate contact of his nose against that small back, something changed. Something gave. The baby lurched forward in the chair, and the sound that came through the speaker was the most extraordinary sound Christiana had ever heard in her life, because it was an ordinary sound, a completely ordinary sound, the sound of a child coughing, one single hard cough that carried with it everything that had been held in the silence before it. Then a gasp. Then breath. Then, for 3 seconds, nothing but the sound of a small person remembering how to exist in the uncomplicated way she had existed an hour ago, before a piece of carrot and the wrong moment turned lunch into something else entirely. Donald's hand left the door handle. On the screen, their daughter turned her head and looked over her right shoulder at Eric with the expression of a child who has just experienced something large and frightening and is now locating the nearest safe thing to collapse against. Her face was still red, her eyes were glassy, her lip had begun the preliminary trembling that precedes the full arrival of tears. She looked at Eric. He looked back at her with those amber eyes, steady and present and entirely unbothered by what he had just done, the way people are unbothered by things that were never a choice to begin with. She burst into tears. Not the sharp, startled cry of pain or shock, the deep, heaving, whole-body tears of a child who was frightened and is now safe and needs the fear to leave through the only exit available to her. She cried with her whole self, the way only very small children and very honest people cry, without managing it or measuring it or holding any of it back. Eric licked her cheek, once slowly from jaw to temple, a single, unhurried stroke that moved through her tears and left a clean path in their wake. Then he circled to her left side and sat. He did not lie down. He sat, upright, pressed against the left leg of the chair, his shoulder a warm wall against whatever might come next. His eyes went to the room. Not to her face, not to the door, to the room, scanning it with the calm, thorough attention of something that has finished one task and is already beginning the next. He was not panting. He was not trembling. There was nothing in his posture that read as aftermath, as relief, as the physical discharge of adrenaline that follows a crisis. He simply sat and breathed and watched and was present, as if what had just happened was not an extraordinary act, but a continuation of the only thing he had been doing since the morning began. His job, quietly, without applause, without acknowledgement, without anyone in the room to see him do it. That was the thing that broke Christiana open completely, not the moment itself, not the cough or the gasp or the tears. It was this, the aftermath, the way he sat in it without needing it to be witnessed or understood or rewarded. The way 120 pounds of animal that 2 hours ago had a pickup time and a numbered kennel waiting sat beside a high chair in an ordinary kitchen and kept watch over a child who was already, through the blurring of her tears, beginning to reach for her corn again. The size of him, the very size of him. The thing that Fred had called dangerous, the thing that Donald had called an accident waiting to happen, the thing that had filled a hallway and made a neighbor uncomfortable and caused a phone call to be made before breakfast on a Tuesday morning. That size was the reason she was breathing. There is documented evidence of large dogs intervening in choking incidents involving infants and small children through applied back pressure, a physical response that requires sufficient mass to be effective. A dog under 40 pounds does not have the body weight to deliver the pressure that clears an obstructed airway in a child. Eric's size, the precise quality that made him a target of fear in this house, was the precise quality that made what he did possible. This is not coincidence. This is biology. And it deserves to be understood rather than feared. Donald had always been a man who processed things in motion. Christiana had known this about him since before they were married. The way he would go for a walk after difficult news, the way he would rearrange things in the garage when a problem was working itself through him, the way stillness and unresolved feeling had never peacefully coexisted in his body. So she was not surprised when he picked up the phone from the counter and looked at it for a long moment and then set it back down and walked out of the kitchen without saying anything to her. She let him go. She understood that what was happening inside him right now was not something she could assist with or accelerate, that it required the particular privacy of a man dismantling something he had built with his own certainty and finding out what was underneath it. She heard him cross the living room. She heard him stop. She did not follow. On the phone screen, Eric's ears swiveled toward the living room doorway. He lifted his chin from the tray and turned his head. He looked at whoever was standing there with the same steady, amber-eyed patience with which he looked at everything, without agenda, without grudge, without any of the emotional complexity that the person looking back at him had every reason to feel. He simply looked, and then, after a moment, he rose. She heard Donald sit down on the floor. Not on the couch, not in the armchair where he always sat in the evenings with the television on and his shoes still tied. On the floor. She knew the sound of it, the particular contact of a person choosing the lowest available position in a room, which is never entirely about the floor and always entirely about the posture of the soul doing the choosing. She heard it and she closed her eyes for just a moment and felt something in her chest release that had been held since the morning, since the address spoken in that flat and finished voice, since the moment she understood what was being taken away. She stayed in the kitchen. She gave him the room. What happened in that living room in the next few minutes was not something she witnessed directly, and she would not have been able to explain afterward why she felt so completely certain of it, but she knew. She knew the way you know things that have already established themselves in your understanding before your eyes arrived to confirm them. She knew that Donald had put his hand on Eric's head. She knew that Eric had accepted it with that complete, uncalculating willingness he brought to every overture that arrived without threat. She knew that the words, when they came, were quiet, not a speech, not an apology constructed for an audience, just the stripped-down minimum of what a man says when he is talking to a creature who deserves more than he is capable of fully expressing. She heard him say, "You're not going anywhere." A pause. "I'm sorry." She turned to the counter and picked up her own phone, not the one with the live feed, her phone, her contacts, and she found Fred's name and she pressed call, and she stood at the kitchen window while it rang and watched the yard outside where nothing was happening, where the afternoon was proceeding with complete indifference to the morning it had grown from. Fred answered on the third ring with the easy, unsuspecting hello of someone who has no reason to expect the call that is coming. She told him what the camera saw. She did not narrate it emotionally. She did not perform the telling. She gave him the facts in the order they occurred. The carrot, the silence, the color of her daughter's face, the 3 strides, the 3 presses, the cough, the gasp, the breath. She gave him Eric's response time, and she gave him the footage which she told him she would send so that he could watch it himself and come to his own conclusion. Because she had learned this morning the hard way what happened when conclusions were reached without evidence, and she had no interest in replicating the method even in the direction of someone who deserved worse from her than she was giving him. There was a long silence on the line when she finished. Fred did not have an answer for it. She had not expected one. Fear, when it has been responsible for something, when it has dressed itself as wisdom and given advice and been believed and acted upon, and then had the full cost of its wrongness laid out in a sequence of undeniable facts. Fear does not have a response for that moment. It only has silence, and the particular quality of that silence which is not peaceful but is not nothing either, which is the sound of a person beginning, slowly and without announcement, to reconsider. She told him she would send the footage. She ended the call. She stood at the window for another moment, and then she went to the living room doorway. Donald was on the floor. Eric was beside him, not in front, not facing him, but beside him, pressed along his right side with his chin on Donald's knee and his eyes at half-mast, his breathing slow and entirely at peace. Donald's hand was on the broad black head, resting there with the unstudied naturalness of a gesture that had found its right position. His face was not performing anything. It was simply a face on the other side of something difficult, quieter than it had been this morning, holding less. He looked up when he heard her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything that needed to be said out loud. That evening, Christiana set 3 places at the table. Donald brought the plates from the counter and set them down, and when he set his own plate he paused, just for a moment, just long enough for it to mean something, and looked at Eric in his position beside the high chair, pressed against the left leg of it, chin at tray level, amber eyes soft in the kitchen light. 120 pounds of dog, who had been given a pick-up time this morning and had spent the day in complete ignorance of it, doing only what he had always done. Donald sat down. He picked up his fork. He looked at his daughter, who was already investigating her dinner with her customary focused enthusiasm, already reaching for the pieces closest to Eric's nose and holding them out in the general direction of his face as an offering, as a greeting, as the small daily gesture of a child who has never known a mealtime without him and cannot imagine one. Eric blinked slowly. He did not take the food. He never did. He simply received the gesture for what it was and stayed where he was and watched the table with the patient, habitual, unconditional attention of something that had made its commitment long before anyone in the room thought to question it, and had kept that commitment this morning and would keep it tomorrow morning, and would keep it on every morning after that, not because anyone had asked him to. Not because he had been rewarded for it, or praised for it, or even noticed for it on the days when nothing went wrong. Because the bond was the bond, and for Eric, that had always been the only reason needed. Donald looked at him for a long moment in the evening light, and in that moment, Christiana watched her husband's face do something she had never quite seen it do before, not soften exactly, because softness implies something that was hard. Maury-like, arrive. Arrive at a place he had been circling for a long time without knowing it was there, without knowing it was the place he had actually been looking for when he thought he was looking for safety, for certainty, for the elimination of risk. Protection was not the absence of a large dog. It never had been. It was 120 pounds of loyal, present, amber-eyed animal who had pressed his nose 3 times between a child's shoulder blades on a Tuesday morning and given her back her breath. It was who stayed. It had always been who stayed. Donald had already called the shelter. Fred had already made his case. And Eric, who had been in that house every single day, never got a single vote. Not one. This channel exists to make sure stories like his don't. Subscribe, we're building something here, and every single subscriber tells us to keep going. Don't let the algorithm decide which stories survive. You decide. Subscribe and make the call yourself. The most dangerous prejudice is the kind that arrives wearing the clothes of responsibility. Donald was not a villain. He was a father who loved his daughter and allowed someone else's unexamined fear to become his own decision. That is not a character flaw unique to him. It is one of the most human things a person can do. But it nearly cost his family everything. Question the fear that reaches you secondhand. Measure it against the evidence living in your own life, your own home, your own daily observation. And when those 2 things conflict, when the fear says one thing and the evidence says another, choose the evidence. Every time, without apology. Did this story change how you see large dogs? Would you have trusted Eric, or would you have sided with Donald in that kitchen this morning, before the camera showed you everything? Be honest with yourself. Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you believe that loyalty like Eric's deserves to be celebrated rather than feared, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who has a dog they don't fully understand yet. Someone who is letting second-hand fear make permanent decisions. Someone who just needs 20 minutes and a camera and the willingness to watch. We'll see you in the next one.